So the UK general election is now only a few days away. I'm recording this at midday on the 2nd of July, and that's 2024. And the UK general election will take place on the 4th. Now, I'm going to discuss issues around betting on not just general elections, but politics generally. There is a widespread systemic bias in the nature of polling, both in the UK, the US, and generally around the world. This bias is never really discussed. People usually explain away the serial failures of polling companies with reference to things like standard error, which is a red herring in this case. There is a systemic and intrinsic bias, and if you're aware of how it works, you will make money betting into elections around the world on a consistent basis. You will actually have some of the highest positive expectations. That's mathematical jargon for how much money you're going to make. You will have some of the highest positive expectations that you can possibly get from gambling on any event without the use of some kind of exploit or angle. Just like using your own judgment to outthink the market. The reason is mainly because of this general election polling bias. Now, the way it works is essentially this. Polling companies almost always understate the actual results of mainstream but particularly centre-left parties. There is a strong and statistically significant correlation that suggests opinion polls conducted before an election will overstate the results of centre-left parties. Centre-left parties will get a lower share of the vote at the actual election than predicted by the polls. Now, the size and extent of this bias varies. It's somewhat random. So while the bias is a statistical fact, viewed historically, going back to elections from about 1980, before which time you don't really have reliable polling data, while it's a statistical fact, assessing the exact bias is more of an art than a science. So bear in mind, you will have a positive expectation using the information I'm going to give you, but there's still an element of risk. So take all this with a pinch of salt. Remember, don't bet money you can afford to lose. It's never a good idea to bet scared money. So let's get straight into it. Let's look at the opinion polls as they stand as of 2nd July 2024. And we can see that the Labour Party has a average percentage vote share of around 40%. So they're going to win significantly in the coming election unless something truly extraordinary happens. Please don't confuse what I'm saying with predicting an actual loss for the Labour Party. What I'm going to say is that they are going to underperform their current share of the polls. Now, they will still win comfortably, likely by what might well be considered a landslide in terms of seats, if not percentage vote share. Now, the way political betting works is that if the polls were accurate, then the Labour Party's actual results, allowing for the standard error, which the pollsters themselves acknowledge, would be within 2% of the projected result. Okay. So you get very short odds for the projected polling estimate of the pollsters. And that's whoever you bet with. Now, my assertion here is that Labour are going to perform to within 33% to 35%. My conjecture is also that because of standard error, there's also still a significant probability of Labour actually underperforming that total and achieving a result of a vote share of between 32 to 33.99%. Now, I place bets on both those odds categories, and as you can see, I got rather higher odds than the current odds. The odds have gone down in the last day. I'm not entirely sure why, because there haven't been any new polls since that time. It's possible my bets themselves may have actually moved the market, because this is rather a niche betting market, as you can imagine. Now, if you're wondering about the rather odd betting distribution there, that's the way a betting exchange works. It's different from a traditional bookmaker. You basically match your bets with other bettors who you have a difference of opinion with. Betfair is basically a peer-to-peer service, and the betting exchange just takes a 5% commission from all bets. It doesn't care who wins and who loses. It's an excellent reason to bet with a peer-to-peer organisation, as no one's really trying to stop you or ban you or pretend you didn't make a bet. All kinds of dirty stuff goes on with actual bookmakers. Betfair don't care because they don't take positions. Now, why do I think Labour are going to do so badly? Well, they're not actually going to do badly. They're just going to underperform the polls. This will still be a historically successful result if I'm right about where their vote share is actually going to fall. The reason is that if you look at elections going back to 1980, there's a persistent correlation between the Labour underperformance at the polls and the perceived left-wing or centred or centrist nature of the party at that current time. So if we look at Michael Foot's election in 1980, you can see that the Labour Party is predicted to do worse than it actually does. It actually performs better than expected by about 3%. Then you look at the Kinnock elections of 1987 and 1992. Kinnock underperforms the polls. Kinnock was widely, for those who lived through that time, Kinnock was widely associated with the modernising wing of the party, trying to compromise your socialist principles or whatever in order to become more acceptable to the electorate. So he underperformed in 1987 and 1992. Those were quite shocking results at the time. I think in 1992 there was a widespread expectation that Labour were actually going to win, and they didn't. There was a lot of fuss about it at the time in the media. Then in 1997 we have Tony Blair. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because with betting, if you know things the market doesn't, you can make money. It doesn't matter how much of an idiot you are in other ways, as long as you know something important the market doesn't know, then everything else tends to average out. And this is something really important. Everyone talks about the 1997 election in political circles as this amazing victory for Labour, and in some ways it was. Because it ended a long period of Conservative rule and Blair got a significant majority. But in polling terms, Blair actually massively underperformed the polls. No one ever talks about this. It's a really important point. The pollsters were out by 10%. I mean, it's huge. And much the same thing happened in the subsequent Blair elections of 2001 and 2005, to a slightly lesser degree. I mean, there was less turnout in those elections, so that would be understandable. But Blair's numbers were always overstated in the polls. Then in 2010, this is the most difficult one for my hypothesis, because Gordon Brown, in retrospect, was quite a centrist candidate. But at the time, he was seen as significantly to the left of Blair. And indeed, the centrist left-wing bias doesn't really show up. And I think it's because it's highly debatable whether Brown was a centrist or left wing. So that is the one, challenge and caveat to the bias that I'm uncovering in this video. If the critics want to have a go, that's a good place to start. So then we go to 2015, and again, Ed Miliband was much criticised, although just some thought he was to the left of Blair. He probably was to the left of Blair. He was much criticised before the 2015 election for, again, trying to appease centrists and conservatives by keeping aspects of the unpopular austerity policies of the then Conservative government. And again, Labour significantly underperformed the polls, which I think is in keeping with my hypothesis. Then the Corbyn election of 2017, Labour massively overperformed their dismal polling share, and it was essentially a statistical tie that, and that again keeps with this notion that the more left wing the party is, the more the more the polls understate its share. It's probably because it's kind of shy voter effect. People don't want to be perceived as extreme or unpopular, so they lie to the pollsters. 2019, it's a very difficult one. Again, it provides something of a challenge to the hypothesis because there was no bias. The polls essentially got it right in 2019. I think the reason is that Boris Johnson's party, Boris Johnson's Conservative Party, which won that election, was also perceived as highly populist. So the Corbyn populism and the Johnson populism essentially cancelled each other out. But at this coming election, I think it's very much the case that Keir Starmer's Labour Party is probably the most right-wing Labour Party I can ever remember. Now, why I'm not actually betting the farm on this one is mainly because of the rather unusual entry of a major third party into the race. So Nigel Farage's Reform Party is polling up to 20% with some pollsters. And it's difficult to see how that's going to affect things. There is kind of a precedent in that the past Nigel Farage's UKIP party, when he was part of that, I think in 2015, significantly overperformed in the actual result relative to their polls. They were projected to get 9%. They ended up with 12.5%. That's a huge error given the small size of their relative vote share. So that's going to distort things to a somewhat unpredictable manner. Now, because it could go either way, I still think there's a significant advantage in betting on the Labour vote share that I've recommended here. But there's so much randomness and variance involved with that. Particularly far-right voters, they tend to be skeptical about pollsters and not necessarily tell them the truth or remove themselves from the sample entirely. I'm not commenting negatively or positively on that. I can see why you might want to hide your opinions from a pollster for perfectly good reasons. I'm just saying that tends to be a thing that happens.